What does it mean to be machine readable? Without getting into complicated discussions of what might be eventual machinery, I think nowadays we could say that it means being some way quantifiable, reducible to numbers. So this is my only slide. It's intended not to be entirely machine readable, perhaps, in a peaceful protest to this quantification. So what I would like to convince you of today is that in many ways, economists themselves have been describing the economy, have been describing the very system that they've been studying with language that is anthropomorphic, with words that suggest some kind of emergence, using concepts and tools that people in the A-Life community are well familiar with. As early as Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, which in many ways revolutionized the way economists understood the economy, we have the use of an invisible hand to describe the way in which participants in an economy or the system itself might produce outcomes that are beneficial for the system by virtue of individual action. But why use an invisible hand to describe this? Why invoke such a mystical, near magical idea to describe this phenomenon? 100 years later, we have Karl Marx using language like a vampire, which sucks blood from the labor force of workers to speak of the system which the workers themselves have a very hard time changing, some system which is much larger than any of the individuals within the system. Now, Marx is typically much more favored on left-leaning political spectra, but this is not a phenomenon that we only find on the left, on a side of politics which perhaps is very critical of capital. Austrian economists like Hayek describe self-organization, spontaneous order, describe the economy, the system they're studying, as a complex system which has features that is greater than any of the sum of the parts. The way in which individuals process information on their own and all individuals together lead to outcomes which are only achievable by this collective behavior. And the Austrian economists would in fact say that any attempt of controlling this system, any imposition of man's creativity, of a single man's creativity on this system, would inhibit the very creativity that is possible of the system itself, as if there is a creativity possible in the system. And even today, in much more traditional economics, in almost apolitical perspectives, economists describe capital or money as seeking areas of lowest risk and greatest return, as balancing risk and return to achieve some goal. Now, what do all these things have in common? We would say that one of the things that they have in common is operation in a medium of quantification, that all of the things that are pursued are ultimately quantitative. And today, computer science tools actually give us the ability to describe such systems. And so what we do in this paper is propose a model. You can look much more closely at the model in the paper, but to give you an intuition of what we're saying is that the reinforcement learning loop, common in computer science, a situation where you have an agent which acts in an environment and receives some kind of a reward, we call that capital. We call that entire loop capital, where these agents are pursuing the accumulation of some kind of quantified value within a system which itself is quantified. They are perceiving quantified states or observations. And in return for what they observe, what they do in the system, they obtain capital units. Now, what is there an issue, or why is it interesting to consider everything as, or capital as, operating within this domain of quantified value? So for this, I would take a philosophical stance, which in a nutshell, I would say to be that there are things which are not quantifiable. And as we see capital growing and spreading, which is what we also wished to reproduce in our model, we find that things are increasingly quantified, that things are increasingly represented in the very means that are required for capital to process, and that allow capital agents to pursue its accumulation. So capital agents for us are any entity which pursues the accumulation of capital and necessarily needs to operate within this quantitative realm. One of the things that is useful from putting things into these terms by using tools from continual reinforcement learning, which actually come from the field of artificial intelligence, to model things like this, is that we are able to then measure something like entropy of a system. We can say something about, potentially we may be able to say something about autopoiesis. So in what way is this artificially intelligent? Now, the first thing that I would like to point out is that there is a way in which AI itself is artificial intelligence, is capital. And I don't like the word artificial intelligence. I think many of us might share that qualm. But when we say artificial intelligence here, we mean these tools of machine learning that we are very commonly familiar with today, with the tools that we all interact with today. And what I would say about artificial intelligence, following in the work of Elena Esposito, is that these machines have been successful precisely because they have not needed to be intelligent. By following this sequence of very simple steps, they have been able to produce amazing results without needing to be intelligent. If anything, what is incredible is that we can produce these results without needing intelligence. I would frame my stance in these terms, speaking about artificial intelligence. So then there's this way in which artificial intelligence itself is capital. And in particular, what we would say it is an agent of capital. It is somehow the most efficient agent of capital that has been produced, insofar as it is something which processes large amounts of quantified value, creates compressed representations of this value to output a new value, a new quantification, which is itself valuable in a different way. And it is incredibly efficient at doing so because we can leverage the tools of mathematics to make sure that we are optimal in a sense. And we see these tools increasingly used and applied within our societies, and we all have our own ideas of how these are influencing our world. I have had many very interesting conversations with many of you on this topic in the past few days, many that have humbled me to knowledge of work that I'm completely unfamiliar with. But I think it's a testament of the kind of phenomenon that is happening at this point in time. We are actively interacting and engaging with systems which are agents of capital in the purest form. So we can see these artificial intelligence systems as pursuing accumulation of capital. There is then another direction that I would like to posit, which is that capital itself can be seen as artificially intelligent. And that would be the case because the way we see it, the agents of capital are pursuing capital accumulation, and they are by necessity operating in a quantitative realm because capital itself is quantified value. In pursuing this capital accumulation on a large scale, all these agents are effectively doing some kind of process which could be reduced to some form of mathematical optimization. In the very same way that these artificially intelligent machine learning tools are ultimately doing some form of mathematical optimization. Now, this, of course, is on a very different scale, in a different way, in a very distributed manner. We make no comment as to the centralized nature of capital or whether it's a very distributed entity, though I certainly believe that there are many agents of capital, all of which may have their own spheres of influence and which we may be able to model in some kind of compositional manner. But what we wish to argue is that the way capital evolves itself has qualities of the artificially intelligent and has qualities of the artificially living in a way which we should keep into account. And what is fascinating today is that we actually get a chance to interact with artificial intelligent systems, with these machine learning systems. And so that can give us a sense of what it means to interact with capital. We all have the experience of chatting with large language models that have an astounding capability of reproducing text which we find meaningful, of saying things which we can believe. Now, recalling the stance that I was taking on what it is to be artificially intelligent, or on the fact that no intelligence was required in the process, another claim that we would make is that we know interacting with ChatGPT that it's just a sample from a pure probability distribution. We know what's going on under the hood. We know that the meaning in the output of this model we can interpret as meaningful, but is not intentional. It is not a purpose-driven process. I recognize that you may disagree with me on this. But if we take this to the next step and consider capital itself as some form of artificial intelligence, this is the claim that we make, that insofar as capital is artificially intelligent, that the information that is produced by capital, that the outcomes of this system are not purposeful. They are not intentionally meaningful, though we can certainly interpret them as meaningful. We have plenty of capability of interpreting them as meaningful, which may then influence our very systems of meaning. And in providing this idea that everything can be quantified and that we can accumulate this quantification, that we can pursue accumulation of quantified value, it is this idea that we see as spreading, somehow autopoietic, self-reproducing. Capital reproduces a form of efficient capital accumulation within it in an almost self-referential manner. And this mathematical model that we describe, which is also purely quantitative, where I have quite clearly stated, I believe things to exist out there which are not quantifiable. But as we increasingly quantify things, as capital keeps encroaching on spheres that might intrinsically have some qualitative value, in an almost self-fulfilling prophecy, it starts to look more and more like this model. Thank you.